This tutorial will explain how to create a login function within your application. A couple of things you will need to be aware of before you watch this video is that you need to have read in your students from a CSV file, and you'll need to have read in your students from a CSV file into a two-dimensional array, and the two-dimensional array then is what you will use then to iterate through, to go through each row to check that the username and password match those stored within the two-dimensional array. So in the geography field trip example, you'll notice that I have a global variable, static string, open bracket, comma, close bracket, students equals new string, number of students, number of bits of info. This is the two-dimensional array that I will reference whenever I'm creating my login function. And the two-dimensional array, don't forget, has two parts to it. You create the reference, which is on the left-hand side. The comma denotes it's a two-dimensional array. And then on the right-hand side is you actually creating the construct, if you like, creating the number of rows and the number of columns. So number of students is the number of rows, so each row represents each student, and the number of bits of info essentially is the number of columns in your two-dimensional array, and that will store the individual bits of information. So now we're going to look at how we actually create a login function. Now remember, whenever your application loads, if you look at the main method, the first thing it does is read in the users in the background, and the read in users silently will read in from the CSV file into the two-dimensional array. And if you want to know how to do this, there is a video which explains how this particular method or function works. You'll see in the main method then, the next method or function that is called is a login method. And the login method then will essentially allow you then to authenticate that the user is a user that exists in your two-dimensional array, which has been read in from the students.csv file. So this is the login method that's called. So if I scroll down, and this is outside the main method, okay, you'll notice there's only two methods in your main method. So the login then will pass over control of the program to another method. So if I scroll down, you see that this particular method begins on line 71 of my geography field trip repo. And what it does is I've created a few variables here just to allow this particular method to work. I've created a boolean, and a boolean, remember, can only be true or false, and I've called it not logged in. And what that allows me to do then is, while the person's not logged in, it will keep asking them to enter their username. Now in this particular method, I've put in essentially all of the login requests. Everything to do with the login is contained within this method. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it this way, but it's just to give you some idea of how it works. Then I've got a string username and password. And the username and password, these are both local variables, i.e. only valid within this particular login method. And the username and password is going to then store the username that the user enters and the password that the user enters. I've also got this other variable, an int, to store login attempts. And in this particular example, what I've done is that I want to record the number of times the user has attempted to log into the application. And I'm only going to give them a finite number of chances. That's, again, not something that you necessarily have to do in your application, but it is just an enriching feature within this particular method. So then what I have is the start of a do while loop. You'll notice the do starts on line 77, and the end of the while loop is down 110. So you've got 40 lines of code all to do with the login. And why have I put it into a do while? Well, I want this to continue to ask them to enter their username until such times as not logged in is equal to false. In other words, they have logged in successfully. at which point then the application then will move on to the next part of the program. So first thing I'm going to do while I've called this app title, which is the banner that you'll see appearing in the application. Now if I click the run button, I'm just going to show you how this works in practice, and then we're going to go through and show the code. Now I need to get a proper username here. Let's get a username. Okay, so let's use that one. So let's use kmartin917. I'll just delete that. 917, and then hit enter. Please enter your password. That's REPL putting in some gobbledygook. Apologies for that. And I'm going to put in password 123. Now you'll notice it asks them to enter their username and their password regardless if the username exists or not. Again, in your application you might want to have it so that whenever they enter the username it says actually this username hasn't been found at that point, and it forces them to enter the username again. Or you can do it in a oneer if you like, where the username and password are both checked at the same time. So once I press the enter key, it should authenticate. You've successfully logged in, and it takes them to the main menu. Okay, so let's see how that's achieved. If we go back to the code, line 70. So there's the app title, if you like, which is showing that on every screen. Then it says please enter your username, and then it's recording the login attempt. Login attempts plus is essentially adding 1 to the counter, recording the number of login attempts. Now then I have another loop within a loop. So what this is doing then is it's continuing to read the username in while they haven't entered anything for a username. So while string, and this is a method of the string class, is null or empty, so while this variable, which is reading in the username, while that contains nothing, continue to ask them. So this method string dot is null or empty needs a string variable sent to it, and it will return true or false. So if it returns true, it will continue to ask them to enter the username. In other words, if the user hit enter without entering a username, it's going to recognize that. So again, this is something you don't have to do it this way. This is just the way I've done it, just for demonstration purposes. So by line 88, I know for sure that I've got a username. Well, I certainly have a string of characters anyway, maybe not a legitimate username. Then I'm asking them to enter their password. Now you'll notice I haven't put this in a do while. I could have, to ensure that the user has entered a password, not left it blank. I could have used exactly the same 4 lines or 5 lines of code, replacing username with password, and then sending password to the method is null or empty. But I've chosen not to do that because it's superfluous. It's not required, and I've already explained the purpose of this loop within a loop. This is a loop within another loop. By this line in the code, I know I have both a username and password. I don't know if that username or password is valid at this point, and this is where the next section of code is important. So then I have this for loop, and this for loop essentially will go through my student's 2-dimensional array. It'll go through each row. So for I equals 0, I is less than students.getLength 0. Remember, .getLength will get, with a 0 in brackets, will return the number of rows in the 2-dimensional array. So this will return, essentially, there are 9 rows in the 2-dimensional array, and that's determined by the CSV file. So students.getLength bracket 0 close bracket will return 9. So in other words, this for loop will iterate through each row in my two-dimensional array. Now, as I go through each row, I need to check if the username and password are correct. So what I've done is I've got little if statements in there. And what I've said is, if the username in the, let's go into this the first time I'm into the loop, the first iteration of this for loop, I is 0. So it will go to row 0, column 0, get the data from there, and check it's equal to the username that the user has entered up here. Now, it goes to column 0 because don't forget, whenever you read the CSV file into your two-dimensional array, this will be put into column 0. So it goes to column 0, or row 0, column 0, and I put in 0 in here because it's always going to be column 0. Okay? It's not always going to be row 0, but it's always going to be column 0, because the row is determined by the counter I. So if in row 0, column 0, if the data stored at that particular location in the two-dimensional array is equal to the username that has been entered by the user, good. Then we get into the inner if. Okay, so if that is true, then let's check the password. So if it's past stage 1 of the authentication process. Now, if the same is true for password, in other words, if it goes to row 0, column 1 this time, and we use column 1 because don't forget that password is stored in column 1 for each row. If the password also checks out, so if that's true, and if that is true, if both are true, which is a nested if, then the user has successfully logged in. So, and all I'm doing is outputting to the screen, you have successfully logged in. And I put this thread.sleep, and thread.sleep is a little delay that you can use to mimic the computer processing the data. You don't have to put that in. That's me just being silly. You don't have to put that in. Using system, if you want to use that, you must put in using system.threading in your using statements. Okay? This allows you to use thread.sleep. So let's go back down to the code. Sorry about that. Now, you'll see there's an else in here. And the else is on the inner if. The else is on the inner if. You look at that, it lines up here and here. So that's on the inner if, and it says, your username or password is incorrect, please try again. And then it calls the login function again. Now, the reason why I put it just on the nested if is just a wee bit of a thing that I've learnt whenever you're logging into an application. A good application doesn't tell the person logging in whether the username was wrong or the password was wrong. It just says the login credentials were incorrect. Okay? If you wanted to, you could put this else here against the outer if, and it will tell them then that the username is incorrect. Okay? So if the username is incorrect, then, or the password is incorrect, it will output your username or password is incorrect, please try again. It will thread.sleep it for, well, 2000 microseconds or 2 seconds, and then it will call the login function. So that will continue to run. That will loop, this for loop will continue to run for each row in the two-dimensional array. If by that point it still hasn't found a user, it will continue to ask the user to log in. In other words, it will just loop. The do while is infinite for the duration of the time that the user hasn't entered a username and password that logs in, which is what you want. So in other words, it will stay on that screen for infinity while the application is loaded. The only time it will load the main menu if the username and password is correctly entered.